this morning. She wishes that she could have been here. As many of you know, she has worked part-time at Ruth's Christian Bookstore there at the mall in Bartlesville, and it was her Sunday to open, and so she needed to stay there to fulfill that obligation. She was particularly sad that she was going to miss the dinner, and so she won't be happy that you all didn't get to have it, but that she'd be happy that she didn't miss it. There are different kinds of constructions of sermons. One is called topical. Topical is where you take a topic and you expound on it. And others are called textual. And that's where you take the word and you take it apart word by word and go into the text. Both have their place. You don't want to get out of balance. You certainly don't want too much of the topical without the text to back it up. But I kind of wanted to explain to you about that a little bit just as a freebie. And this will be a topical sermon this morning, which I don't do very many of, but we will today. As the story goes, there was a Baptist preacher, and he and his wife decided that they were getting up in years a little bit. Their children were all left home. They were an empty nest family, and so they needed to fill the void of those kids that had been there. They needed to get a dog. And they thought, boy, you know, this is really a big deal. They were ever mindful of the congregation, and so they knew that the dog must also be, as they were, Baptist. And so they visited a very expensive kennel, and they explained their needs to the manager, and the manager assured them that he had just a dog for them. So the dog was produced, and the manager said to the dog, "Fetch the Bible." And immediately this dog went over, and on a low shelf there in the pet store, in the kennel, the dog picked up the Bible and brought it back, unscrutinized, and then the manager said, "Okay, dog, find Psalm 23. The dog's paws began to flip through the pages and stopped on Psalms 23, which the dog showed remarkable dexterity in his paws. Duly impressed, the Baptist pastor and his wife purchased the dog. That very evening, they were having a group of parishioners come into the parsonage and for a Bible study. The preacher and his wife began to show off the dog. They had him locate several Bibles throughout the home, and the visitors were amazed. And finally, one of the parishioners asked the pastor, he said, "Can he do normal tricks, normal dog tricks?" And the preacher said, "Well, let's see." And pointing his finger at the dog, he said, "Dog, heel." The dog immediately jumped up on a chair, placed one paw on the preacher's forehead, and began to howl. The preacher and his wife turned and exclaimed, "Good grief, we bought a Pentecostal dog." Hope you gained something out of it this morning. Dag Hammarskjöld, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations during the mid and late 50s, gives us words this morning to begin with that throb with wisdom when he said, "You cannot play with the animal in you without becoming wholly animal. You cannot play with the falsehood without forfeiting your right to truth. Play with cruelty without losing your sensitivity of mind. He who wants to keep his garden tidy doesn't reserve a plot for weeds." For us to live a life without weeds is what we in our theology would refer to in Christendom as a holy life, as a sanctified life. Those who have grown up in the Nazarene Church, the Church of God, the Wesleyan Church, many of those are almost exactly the same, just change the name over the door, recognize those terms. They're part of our heritage. They're part of what we've heard about most of our life. And many times it's without as much understanding as perhaps we may have. This is the doctrine dealing with this sanctified life that we are going to deal with this morning. The doctrine is referred to as entire sanctification. I'm not sure if that's something, how many of you have heard entire sanctification as you run, okay? So that's not a new phrase to you. Although, as we proceed, you may find that if you haven't heard that you're familiar with a similar thought, similar doctrine, might be called by another name. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this morning I want to clarify these three areas about sanctification. First, what is entire sanctification? The second that we'll deal with is, do I need it? Do you need it? And the third is, what does it look like in the life of the believer? Now, the English word that we use, sanctification, comes from the Latin sanctificato, catio, meaning the act or the process of making holy or of consecrating. In the Greek New Testament, the root for several words is a word called hag. There's a reason I want to get into all of this depth of word study and those kind of things. I think it'll help clarify what it is when we talk about sanctification. This root word hag is the basis. And by the way, Dr. Weeder, for those of you who don't know, was my Greek professor at Oklahoma Wesleyan. So when you have to hear all this stuff, if you don't like it, and of course you don't blame me, you blame him when it comes next week. Okay, tell him next week, Dr. Mark, you bored me to tears last week. Well, see, I wasn't even there, but it's still his fault. That root word hag is the basis of hagios, which means holiness, the purity of holiness or consecration, sanctification, which we'll talk a little more about. Hagiosine, which again is another form of holiness. Hagiotes, hagiazo, which means to sanctify or to consecrate or to treat as holy, to purify. And finally, hagios. And hagios, everybody say that, hagios. Hagios. Remember that for next week. Dr. Mark will be so proud when you know what that means. Hagios is an overall kind of an encompassing word or idea of the word sanctify, from where we get our doctrine of entire sanctification. And it means to set something apart. It means to set something apart as in dedicated wholly or solely to God. So, God is separate, and things and people dedicated to His use are also in that context separate. So we know that the word sanctify means to be set apart from, or rather for God. But set apart from what? Well, it means to be set apart from the world. It means to be set apart from ungodliness or set apart from sin. And then the doctrine of entire sanctification refers to the process of one's life being totally set apart from those things, that are indicative of a life being lived out in a totally God-focused manner. This phrase that we use, entire sanctification, may be one as not all of you raised your hands, it may be one that's new to you. But you may have heard it by other names that other denominations or other doctrines use that is primarily the exact same teaching. A word here or two may be different. Maybe you've heard Spirit-filled. Maybe you've heard baptism of the Holy Spirit. Maybe you've heard second touch of grace. I think that's very common. I know in many Nazarene churches I hear second touch of grace. And until I understood what all that meant, that kind of bothered me. I thought God's grace was enough once and for all. It's just because we don't know what we're saying. Let me bring out the point with that too. I'm going to jump to the side of the text for just a moment. I wasn't raised in the Church of God Nazarene Wesleyan theology. I was raised in a church that was founded by John Wesley, but has not adhered real closely to his teachings. And I grew up in a church that I won't mention its name. That's not fair. Its initials were United Methodist. And so things operated a little differently. When my wife and I first visited a Wesleyan church, we got into the Sunday school class.